Segment 7A, Introduction. In this lecture, we do our best to get into the heads of the ancient Romans and move to the Roman way of making war. The similarities between Roman and American civilization are interesting. For example, both societies are characterized by theoretical equality, when in fact both societies were under the rule of elderly, wealthy males. But then the differences are pretty interesting as well. For example, the Roman state religion was almost devoid of what we would call real spiritual content. Segment 7B, Mos Maiorum, Way of Our Elders, examines the two underlying principles of Roman society. First is the Patria Potestas, power of the Father, which replicated itself in Roman politics, economic life, and even religion. I smell an essay exam question. Second is the fixation upon the Mos Maiorum, Way of Our Elders, which the Romans held up as the measure of all proper conduct. Essay question. The Romans took these two principles very seriously, but the foundation of the Roman Republic contradicted them both. The break from monarchy was itself so drastic a deviation from the Mos Maiorum because Rome had never had elective government before. Moreover, the election of completely new magistrates every year made two men, called consuls, into the father figures of the Roman state every year. Fortunately for the Romans, they more often than not recognized when a change from the Mos Maiorum was in fact necessary. Segment 7C, the Roman state religion, cuts into the heart of what the ancient Romans did and did not believe. The Romans started out worshiping formless spirits called noumena. But through Etruscan and Greek influence, the Romans came to visualize their gods and goddesses in human form. For example, their supreme god Jupiter. Yet the Roman deities didn't really care about the Romans' moral conduct. The Romans didn't believe their gods and goddesses interfered in their lives unless they were persuaded or bribed to do so. To the Romans, prayer was a social contract. The deity was rewarded if and only if he or she did what the mortal asked. "Oh Lord, would you give me a Mercedes-Benz? And if you don't give me a Mercedes-Benz, then I don't give you anything either." Roman religious rituals were complicated to the point of being utterly ridiculous. At the same time, the Roman state's well-being depended on the exact performance of these rituals in accordance with the Mos Maiorum. So these ridiculous rituals would be performed over and over and over again until they were done correctly. In segment 7D, Wars and Peaces, we examine some of the major reasons for the Romans' military success. First, every Roman citizen was automatically a soldier, which was a great source of civic pride. The Romans also had the concept of the jus fetialis, or the just war, which specified that Rome should only fight defensive battles. Roman gods and goddesses would not support aggressive territory grabbing. Even though the Romans did not win every single battle in the first 2 centuries of the Republican era, they always wound up at the top at the end of the war. Overall, Roman armies proved so successful that they defeated more enemies and conquered more territory that they wound up with more ager publicus, or public land, than they really knew what to do with. The unorganized, scattered, random arrangements Rome made after winning her victories would rise up to haunt Rome in the end. Segment 7B, Mos Maiorum, Way of Our Elders. Every nation prides itself on its core values. A nation's real core values may differ from its official core values expressed in its laws. For instance, neither the Constitution nor any U.S. law states that countries which mess with the United States will regret it bitterly. Yet it's one of America's core values that nobody messes with the United States without regretting it bitterly. Americans also tend to believe that their individual political beliefs reflect the nation's core values. For example, some interpret the writings of our founders as proof that America always was and always should be a Christian nation. Others use the writings of our founders as evidence that church and state should always remain completely separate. Even though scholars have been reading and interpreting the writings of our founders for 2 centuries now, I don't see Americans coming to a consensus on this question about the church-state relationship anytime soon. The Romans prided themselves on having exactly the same core values as those held by their ancestors. The Romans were so sure that their core values lived in every Roman's heart that they didn't even have to be written down. They were in the Roman blood. In Latin, the Romans refer to their ancient ancestral core values as the mos maiorum, the way of our elders. Immediately after birth, an infant Roman was laid on the ground for his or her father to acknowledge as his own. The father alone decided whether to raise the child or not, and if not, the child was abandoned. This is a vivid illustration of what the Romans called patria potestas, a father's absolute power over his wife and his children. In his role as pater familias, the father made all the decisions with no input from anybody else. He could decide who his children married. He could give them up for adoption or sell them into slavery. He could even kill his children himself if he wanted. The father's power over his children and his wife lasted until the day he died. A man became a full-fledged paterfamilias only after his father died. A father's power over his daughter lasted until the day she married into her husband's family. When a woman married into her husband's family, she then acquired her husband's paterfamilias. Note, though, that many Roman women obeyed their birth father rather than that of the family they married into. Blood in ancient Rome ran thicker than marriage vows. A divorced woman was returned to the control of her oldest male relative until she remarried. A widow was returned to the control of her son. Unsurprisingly, a wife's status in Roman tradition was roughly equivalent to that of her children. As the supreme god Jupiter was to the universe, so the father of the house was to his wife and to his children. Roman society was the Roman family writ large. The 2 social classes in early Rome were the patricians, which consisted of the upper class, and the lower class called the plebeians. The word patrician is derived from the Latin word pater, meaning father. The word plebeian comes from the verb pleo, meaning just to fill up. According to the almighty mos maiorum, the patrician class's relationship to the plebeians was analogous to the power of the paterfamilias over his wife and children. Once the ancient Roman kings were run out, only patricians got to hold elected office and wield the almighty imperium. Only patricians could command armies and dispense justice. Plebeians were expected to do as they were told without any hope of bettering their lot. Marriage between the 2 classes was strictly forbidden. But to help take care of plebeian social concerns, the Romans developed a practice called patronage, in which a given patrician served as patron, yet another word derived from pater, to a number of plebeian clients. The patron provided his clients help with legal protection, and he gave them handouts when times were rotten. He also commanded his clients in the army during wartime, and may even, when needed, have provided them with weapons. In return, clients did whatever favors the patron might ask. They often lined up at his house at daybreak to say good morning and see if he had any work for them to do. If the patron was running for political office, the clients were expected to follow the patron around and serve as his bodyguards and or his applauding audiences. This patron-client relationship extended to all parts of Roman life. Also included in the mos maiorum was the cursus honorum, or course of offices through which a Roman could rise politically. Because opposition to monarchy had become a Roman core value, the Romans believed that politicians should rise up a ladder of offices to the highest office, or consulship. While a politician didn't absolutely have to be a certain age to run for office, or even to hold the previous office in the cursus honorum, exceptions were very few. Holding a magistracy twice in a row was very strongly frowned upon by the mos maiorum. And here the offices come from the top down. 2 consuls, minimum age of service 43 years old. They could summon assemblies, could command armies, and possessed imperium. 2 praetors, minimum age to serve 40, could conduct trials in the forum, could command armies, had imperium. 4 aediles, minimum age to serve 34, oversaw public works and put on public games at private expense. 10 quaestors, minimum age to serve 31, affiliated with the Roman treasury, and the election to quaestor carried with it automatic appointment to the Roman Senate. 3 other offices existed outside of the cursus honorum. 10 tribunes, or protectors of the plebeians. They had to be completely of plebeian blood. They could veto anything that was going on anywhere, anytime in the Roman state by saying the Roman word for veto, which is veto. And anyone who laid a finger on a tribune during his term of office was to be punished severely and immediately. 2 censors were elected every 5 years from among the ex-consuls. They had a census, or a counting of all citizens, and they examined senators for morality. Finally, there was the office of dictator. The dictator was elected only in case of severe emergencies. The dictator held office alone for no more than 6 months and worked with an assistant called the master of horse. Once the dictator's term was over, he was through, regardless of whether he had solved the problem or not. Finally, the Romans had 3 official popular assemblies in descending order of importance. The Centuriate Assembly, which elected consuls and praetors. The Tribal Assembly, which elected aediles and quaestors. And the Assembly of the People, which elected tribunes. Any of these 3 assemblies could and did pass laws which were binding upon the Roman state. The 4th and most powerful assembly, the Senate, otherwise known as the patres or fathers, was officially just an advisory body. It could not, supposedly, pass binding laws. But the Senate's advice basically, according to the Mos Maiorum, had the force of Roman law. In other words, the Senate had patria potestas, the power of a father, over the Roman government. And what a Roman's father said was what a good Roman did. Yet, another part of Rome's genius included its ability to move away from the Mos Maiorum when it was clearly necessary. The foundation of the Republic, supposedly in 509 BC, was just the first example. Another example is Rome's creation of its first written law code, the Code of 12 Tables, around 451 or 450 BC. The plebeians had gotten fed up with how the patrician magistrates interpreted the laws which had not yet been written down. It seemed that no matter what the circumstances, the laws somehow always went against the plebeians. After decades of agitation, a code of laws was drafted and adopted. Granted, the resulting Code of 12 Tables was not a systematic set of laws. It still favored the patricians. For one thing, it specified for just about any offense a stricter penalty for a guilty plebeian and a less strict penalty for a guilty patrician. Yet, the Code of 12 Tables fundamentally stabilized Roman society by establishing what we call the rule of law. Over a period of time, through a process called the conflict of the orders, the plebeian class built upon the rule of law to win further concessions, such as the right to elect tribunes, to marry into patrician families, and even to hold the consulship. The system of quote-unquote Latin rights made it possible for Italians blessed with such rights to transition smoothly into Roman citizenship, adding not only numerical weight, but needed fresh blood to the Roman citizen body. Segment 7C, the Roman state religion. Like most ancient societies, the Romans started out worshiping animistic deities, that is, gods and goddesses with no particular human personality and no particular human appearance. These animistic deities, or noumena, were generally connected with agriculture and the home. For example, Sterculinus or Sterculius, the name means poop god, was the god of manure. Bizarre as the concept of a poop god sounds to us 21st century city slickers, the Romans may not have understood why poop made such an effective fertilizer. They knew only that it worked. And the Romans intended to keep the poop doing its job, of course, by offering thanks and praise to Sterculius, the poop god. Even when Rome became more urbanized after it became the largest city in the world, this sort of animistic deity remained popular. The Cloaca Maxima, built under the Etruscans to drain the swamps between the hills of Rome into the Tiber River, was overseen by a goddess known as Cloacina, or sewer goddess. Since the sewer kept the Roman Forum dry, obviously Cloacina had to be kept happy. Later on, Cloacina was associated with the Roman goddess of beauty and love. Venus was her name. You got it? Early in their history, the Romans acquired from the Etruscans a state religion based upon anthropomorphic ancient Greek deities. But the Romans never forgot or ignored the humble religious practices of their illustrious ancestors. The household gods called the Lares and Penates were especially beloved, as was the personal genius or guardian spirit. In imperial times, the emperor's genius would itself be worshipped as a god, but that's several chapters later. The mos maiorum especially applied to Roman religion. Before explaining how the Romans assimilated anthropomorphic ancient Greek deities, I need to define two terms. First, the word anthropomorphic means that these gods and goddesses basically look and behave like mortal men and mortal women. Only they're more stronger, more beautiful, and immortal. Belief in anthropomorphic deities usually becomes more common as the civilization becomes more advanced. An anthropomorphic deity with a human appearance and human personality traits often seems easier to understand and easier to persuade than an animistic counterpart. The animistic supreme god of the archaic Romans was Jupiter, or Shining Father. Jupiter was quite literally a lightning bolt. He liked to strike oak trees, which became the official tree of this animistic god. Through a process called syncretism, the Romans gradually adopted the Greek gods and goddesses, usually in Etruscanized form. Syncretism suggested that Jupiter basically was equivalent to the Greek god Zeus, hurler of thunderbolts and the #1 cause of pregnancy in ancient Greece. Through syncretism, Jupiter's wife Juno became associated with Zeus's wife Hera. The Roman housecraft goddess Minerva became associated with the Greek housecraft goddess Athena. The sewer goddess Cloacina became associated with the love goddess Venus. It's generally assumed that the funky Etruscans were also involved in this process, as many Etruscan deities show both Greek deities' names and the Roman deities' personalities. Finally, the Roman anthropomorphic gods and goddesses made up a family ruled in the very best Roman sense by the great, shining paterfamilias Jupiter, formerly a lightning bolt. Unlike the major religions of the Roman world, and certainly unlike the Judeo-Christian tradition in which most, if not all of us, are brought up, the ancient Roman deities didn't care at all about things like human morality or human actions. The relationship between Romans and their deities was not a spiritual bond, but a business contract. A Roman prayed for favor from a god or goddess, and offered to do the deity a favor, if and only if the deity provided a favor. In Latin, this was called do ut des, or I give so that you may give. If the favor was granted, the Roman was expected to carry out his or her end of the bargain. If the favor was not provided, the Roman was under no obligation to do anything. In the case of the official public rituals dating back to Rome's second king, Numa Pompilius, these rituals had to be performed exactly as handed down, or again, the gods would be angry. The pax deorum, or peace of the gods, would be violated. If there was any flaw in the ritual, or the sacrificial animal made the wrong noise, or the priest mispronounced a phrase, or someone in the audience started laughing, the entire ritual had to be started again from scratch, a process called instauratio. In particularly difficult political or military situations, the Romans would naturally assume that some god or goddess had been offended. The Romans' difficulties would continue, they believed, until the offended deity had been identified, no small task, and won back into good graces. As a rule, the Romans were open to the worship of other people's deities, provided that these other people were willing to worship Roman deities. The only exception was made in the case of religions which seemed to go against the official Roman core values, such as the Bacchic ritual of Dionysus in the 2nd century BC, and the Jewish grouping known as the Christians, who emerged in the 1st century AD. We can speak of the Romans' religion as a state religion, because it was run by the Roman state for the good of the Roman state. In the days of the monarchy, the king was the supreme priest of the religion and appointed all of the other priests. In republican times, the chief priest, or Pontifex Maximus, was elected, as were the members of the other lesser priesthoods. The magistrates of the Roman state also had the right to consult augurs, haruspices, and other brands of fortune tellers on behalf of the state. Practically from Rome's founding, kings and then magistrates built huge temples to the great gods and goddesses, especially the Capitoline trio of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. Each temple became the site of rituals enhancing the glory of the Roman state and the glory of the magistrate who built the temple. Although the Roman state religion was a great unifying factor in Roman life, it failed the Roman people in one crucial respect. The Roman gods and goddesses didn't care about humans, so there seemed to be no reason for human existence. Just be a good Roman, do your duty, don't ask questions. And the Roman religion offered no hope of a satisfactory afterlife. Greco-Roman myths of the afterlife traditionally offered lots of depressing details, but no reason to live and very little comfort about what might happen afterwards. So the Roman people as a whole would turn to other forms of worship to better meet their spiritual needs. And this spiritual dissatisfaction with the Roman state religion only got deeper as society changed, but the religious rituals remained static. 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 Stop. Segment 7D, Wars and Peaces. From the beginning of Roman times, military service was not an obligation for citizens, it was a privilege. Only citizens who could afford their own weapons were allowed to serve. The more equipment and the better equipment a citizen could purchase, the greater his role in the army and the greater his political rights. It was assumed that those with the most money could afford the best equipment. Better equipped soldiers did more service to the Roman state, and therefore the better equipped soldiers deserved more of a voice in Roman government. The lowest proletarians fought with slings and rocks. The better off could fight with cheap swords and cheap armor. The better off patricians could afford better weapons and could even afford to serve as cavalry. No wonder the idealized picture of Roman life, back in the days of the mos maiorum, included a pater familias, who went from the field to the battlefield and back as needed. One such Roman hero was the general Cincinnatus, who was literally called from the fields to learn he had been elected dictator. The Romans also celebrated the equally heroic mother who did her work and her absent husband's work while he was gone. Since Rome's enemies in her earliest days were Rome's neighbors, also agricultural societies, there was a gentleman's agreement in effect that wars would start after the planting was done and end in time to harvest the crops. Military organization was just part of the Roman success. We've seen that the Romans were fanatical about observing religious ritual. This fixation upon ritual was part of Roman warfare as well, as shown by the jus fetialis and the concept of the just war. The Romans believed that their deities would grant Roman victory if and only if the Romans had been wronged. That is, provided the Romans themselves didn't start the war. The case for war had to be discussed openly by the Roman Senate in the presence of the Roman people, meaning that all Roman citizens had at least some, even if it was passive, part in the decision. Supposedly, Numa Pompilius himself, second king of Rome, established the way by which war was first declared and then announced, by hurling a spear into hostile territory. If the hostile territory was too far away, say in Carthage, a spear could be hurled into a special part of the forum which had been reserved and labeled hostile territory for just this purpose. Official law, or jus fetialis, was a distinct and unique reflection of Roman religious scruples. On the other hand, even the most monstrous and greedy dictators, like Hitler and Stalin in the last century, have tried to present themselves as the aggrieved party before unleashing what is clearly an aggressive war. The Roman army fought as well as it did in large part because all but the poorest of Roman citizens had a personal stake in the army's success. By 272 BC, Rome became master of all Italy. The Latin League was effectively broken up in 338 BC. Its cities had received Latin rights, which usually but not always led to full citizenship. The Etruscan cities were not so much defeated as they were assimilated, and they tended to receive full Roman citizenship as soon as they were taken over. Many other Italian cities saw the writing on the wall and willingly allied themselves with the up-and-coming new Romans. But some held out. For example, the powerful mountain tribe called the Samnites. The Romans and the Samnites fought on and off for 50 years all over southern Italy. And the outcome was not a foregone conclusion. At the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 BC, the Samnites wiped out an entire Roman army. Once the Romans finally beat the Samnites for good in 290, they refused to grant the Samnites the usual generous peace terms. The Samnites responded by nursing their injuries and plotting revenge. The Romans were also invaded twice by Gauls out of the north. In 386 BC, Rome itself was occupied. In desperation, the Romans elected the general Camillus, who had been in exile, as dictator. Under Camillus, the Romans drove off the Gauls and paid them very well to stay away from Rome. After saving Rome, Camillus just gave up his dictatorship and went back to the farm in the very best Roman tradition. Between 290 and 284 BC, Rome fended off another Gallic tribe out of the north called the Senones. Roman victory in the Pyrrhic Wars of 282 through 272 BC, first undertaken to guard Rome's sphere of influence in southern Italy, effectively made Rome the master of all Italy for good. During these wars of conquest, the Romans captured many prisoners, which were simple to deal with. They became slaves. Dealing with the defeated city-states, however, would become a big problem. So would dispensing the ager publicus, or farmland conquered during the war. The term ager publicus means literally public land. somehow it wound up in private hands. The early Romans had never dreamed that their state would become so powerful. Since Rome's wars over the years had occurred with no particular pattern, the Romans had not established a set procedure for dealing with the territories they had won and the allies they had made along the way. Some problems could be handled by increasing the number of magistrates, or by letting conquered city-states continue to rule themselves under Roman guidance. But the sheer inconsistency of Rome's arrangements eventually caused a great deal of grief. For one thing, as I've adumbrated, the Augur Publicus tended to wind up not in the government's hands, but in the hands of the conquering generals and friends of the conquering generals. Sometimes the Romans established colonies, settlements full of Roman citizens which became independent cities. Some lucky citizen states were granted full Roman citizenship with all of its benefits: right to Roman justice, the right to marry a Roman, the right to do business with Romans, and the right to vote in Roman elections, along with the obligations to pay taxes and serve in the army. A number of city-states got partial citizenship, usually the so-called Latin rights, which usually did lead to Roman citizenship. But finally, some cities and some peoples, like the Samnites, didn't get much of anything at all, merely the right to pay Roman taxes and to provide soldiers for the Romans' wars. This category of cities often remained under the control of the traditional local elites, with, of course, a certain amount of Roman supervision. This greatly pleased the local elites, who became Romanized pretty quickly. It didn't so much please the local plebeians or proletarians. From time to time, some forward-thinking Roman politician would come up with some sort of plan for creating some kind of common Roman citizenship and having it go throughout Italy. But ideas of this sort tended to get very dangerous to the men who had them. Under the Roman client-patron system, any city receiving full Roman citizenship in this way would automatically become the client of whichever Roman politician had gotten citizenship for them. Such an individual power, of course, would fly in the face of the mos maiorum. Eventually, the Romans preferred to fight the bloody and stupid social war of 91 to 88 BC rather than grant citizenship to all Italy. Only the prospect of the war in the East made the Romans give in. But that is another story. Segment 7E, Conclusions. 1. Dad's the boss. Roman society is the Roman family writ large. Pater familias, patria potestas, patricians, patres, Jupiter. The base P-A-T-R, meaning father, is present in the name or title of each of Rome's most important authority figures. Even though the Romans were proudly democratic after 509 BC, or whenever they really did kick out the last king, their society was based on a nuclear family, a base family in which the father exercised absolute power, including that of life or death. The Republic's annual elections and collegial magistracies were designed to make one-man rule impossible. The tensions between democracy and patriarchy were too strong to go away, and they too wound up rising up to defeat Rome in the end. 2. One people, one religion. For all of its silliness and lack of what we would consider spiritual content, the Roman state religion still helped bring the Roman people together. In the first place, worship of the old-timey agricultural gods and household gods like the Lares and Penates, or dear old Sterculinus, the poop god, never stopped. Assimilation of Roman deities such as Jupiter, Juno, and Mars, with Greek deities such as Zeus, Hera, and Ares, actually added to the awe and respect factor of the Roman state religion. The Romans could also believe that their religion gained vitality by literally absorbing the gods, goddesses, and religious cults of the cities it conquered over the years. Yet this Roman state religion was already lacking in spiritual content. National pride in the glorious Roman Republic and the glorious Imperium Romanum was all well and good. But a religion which does not explain human existence, a religion which does not give any hope of any kind of afterlife, or which does not really compel good behavior, is not really meeting the needs of the people it supposedly serves. 3. Democracy versus oligarchy. The mechanics of Roman elections were very complicated, and they favored the more wealthy voters. For example, magistrates who had imperium, that means consuls and praetors, were elected by the centuriate assembly. And the centuriate assembly was openly stacked in favor of people who had more money. Consequently, in order to become politically prominent, a family had to either be very rich or it had to become very rich. Although this was not the most democratic way to proceed, at least the process of becoming wealthy became a test for Roman families trying to win political influence. New blood did enter the Roman ruling classes, but the interests of this new political elite, the so-called noble class, were rather more business-oriented than the approach of the old patricians from the days of the mos maiorum. 4. The civilized wars and the uncivilized wars. The Roman concept of jus fetialis remains present to this very day. The Romans believed that their deities would not support Roman military efforts unless the Romans were demonstrably in the right. The record would indicate that the Romans' belief was accurate. More importantly, the process of determining whether an impending war was just or unjust meant that the Romans could not undertake wars rashly. The Romans eventually figured out workarounds for making their enemies attack. They found workarounds for convincing their deities that they were really in the right no matter what happened, much as societies do today.